What's up, everyone? Today's video is going to be very simple. Patch 6.15 was released today, and so we're just going to go through it together, and I'll give you some of my thoughts on it. Alright, so let's just jump into it. So first we have a nerf to Braum's base damage. His passive concussive blows has been nerfed in the early game, but a slight buff in damage the later the game goes on. And his Q, Winter's Bite, has been reduced by 10 damage at all ranks. Now this change isn't really that big of a deal. I think Braum will still be top tier, and really the biggest difference will just be his early game kill pressure. The next change is to Corki's passive. It's been reduced by 60 seconds, which I think is pretty important for him. His ult's extremely powerful for team fights and making picks, so I definitely think you might see some more Corki comps, but there's just so many better ADC picks still out there, so we'll just have to see. And the much-needed Hecarim nerf. Hecarim has been a picker ban the last few weeks, and while I don't see this nerf on his base attack damage and his Q base damage completely changing that, I definitely think it's a good step in balancing him out a bit. Again, this is another pretty small nerf, so I can't say with confidence whether or not he'll still be a picker ban, but I'd still expect to see a lot of Hecarim picks. The change to Alawi is that you can now see her tentacles even if they are hidden in the brush. I don't play top lane, so I don't really know how impactful this will be, but I can only assume this was a good change. Next, we have Jarvan IV getting a buff on his E. The passive attack speed is now up by 3 to 5% at each rank, and the active attack speed by the same amount. Jarvan's one of those champions that I don't really see very often anymore, but when I do, I feel like they always do really well. So honestly, I think this will make J4 extremely viable, and I might even try him out myself. This buff will help his clear, his dueling, and it'll even give him some better siege potential. So definitely my sleeper pick of the patch. Another champion that has been top tier as of late is Karma. I've seen her support, mid, and even top lane. In this patch, they nerfed her E's shield amount by 10 at each rank, and she can no longer target minions. And when using Mantra for her E, the movement speed buff is now scaling, so her early and mid game will be a little weaker. This nerf makes perfect sense. I think Karma has a cool kit, but it has been a little overpowered, and I think this is exactly what she needed to bounce out. Next, Kassadin gets a buff. Kassadin's one of those champions who has such a broken kit that Riot has to be extremely careful when they decide to buff him. As you can see, he got a slight damage buff on his Q and a smaller mana cost for his E. Kassadin scales really well, but I think the problem with Kassadin is just his lack of wave clear, so despite this buff, I don't think we'll really see an increase in Kassadin picks. From one void to the other, we have Malzahar getting a nerf, and I'm definitely happy to see this. His passive now has a longer cooldown as he approaches the late game, and his shield duration on his passive has been cut down a lot. Nidalee has received possibly the biggest buff this patch. Her Q in both forms has been given a huge damage buff in the early game, and her late game will be about the same. The second change is she can no longer auto-attack reset by switching forms. Nidalee is one of those champions that if you can play her right, you can absolutely dominate your opponents. She's pretty hard to play, but with this sizable buff, I would definitely expect Nidalee to jump back into the top tier jungler list, especially at high elos where people can play her well. Next up, Renekton gets a buff to his ult damage per second, and he now gains 20 Fury on cast. Again, top lane is not my domain, but I can pretty confidently say that this will increase Renekton picks and definitely make him a force to be Renektoned with. See what I did there? Then with Shen, they just reduced his base health regen, so Shen will be now slightly easier to punish in lane. Shyvana gets a buff to her ult as well. She now passively builds Fury quicker in the early game, which means she'll be able to ult more frequently, which means she'll be able to make more plays around the map. Definitely a solid buff for all of you Shyvana players. Sona has quickly become a god tier support with her recent changes, but they did hotfix her by reducing the power of her healing and speed buffs, and now in this patch they just reduced a bug where she could cast W immediately after casting E without incurring a global cooldown. Kind of a big bug, so definitely a good fix. Next, Talia gets a longer cooldown on her ultimate at rank 1 and 2, so pretty self-explanatory. A new functionality has been added to Vayne's Tumble. She now does bonus damage to structures as well as champions when she tumbles. With Victor, they just made it so his Chaos Storm Cloud only moves at max speed when it's returning to Victor. Not a whole lot to say about it. Next, we have Vladimir. Vladimir's base movement speed was reduced by 5. The cooldown on his W is up a few seconds at each rank. Basically, this will just make Vladimir less slippery, a little bit easier to kill, but nothing too crazy. Then with Zac, he just got a bug fix. You can no longer fuck up your E by accidentally hovering over the minimap. Lastly, for the champions, we have Zyra getting a damage buff to her Q in the middle and late game. Zyra, in my opinion, is already pretty strong. This just reinforces that. The biggest change to this patch is undoubtedly the change to outer turrets. The first change to outer turrets is that they now give 50 less shared gold, they have 200 extra health, and the fortification damage reduction has been upped from 35 to 50%, but now only lasts for 5 minutes. And fortification's damage reduction no longer applies to bottom lane turrets. The reasoning behind this change was stated as follows. Lane swapping, while difficult to pull off, has become the formulaic default strategy for teams in the professional scene. Having a go-to strategy isn't wrong by any means, but the prevalence of lane swaps has all but removed direct conflict from the early game stages of the game. We believe that games of League should be won by interacting with your opponents, and while lane swapping is certainly a kind of interaction, its prevalence has removed almost all early aggression strats from viability. That said, we're not looking to outright remove the ability to pull off swaps. We think they're fine as situational strategies, for example, avoiding bad matchups. They just don't have enough of a real cost for the team that swaps. These changes push teams to carefully consider whether it's worth sacrificing gold and tempo if they want to opt for the path of least resistance, rather than defaulting to lane swapping in every situation. The second change to turrets is that they now give off a first blood bonus. Just like getting first blood on champions, the team that takes the first turret now gets a first blood from that as well. The first blood bonus gold from turrets is 400, 25 being awarded to each champion and 275 gold split between nearby champions. I personally feel this is an enormous change. Securing first tower now can become priority over any other objective. The bonus gold for taking first turret is comparable to securing first dragon before the dragon changes. All in all, I think it's a cool change, definitely an interesting one, and I don't know what kind of impact it'll have in terms of team compositions and early game strats, but it's definitely significant enough to have an impact on champion picks, so we're just gonna have to wait and see how the pros respond to it. That is the end of this video though. I know this video was rather bland. I just wanted to throw in some of my thoughts on the current patch. We have a new Lee Sin build challenge video tomorrow, and it's going to be AP Lee Sin mid, so it's definitely going to be interesting. Until then, I'll see you guys later.
They gon' try to hate on you, just ignore everything they say. Don't listen to nobody, and never be afraid, cause you don't know when it could be your day.